Welcome to another Before You Read lecture. This is on Genesis chapters 37 through 45. With the start of Genesis 37, we near the final set of stories in the book of Genesis. These chapters cover events related to Jacob's sons. With the exception of a diversion in chapter 38, more of that later, these chapters focus on Joseph, one of Jacob's youngest sons and clearly one of his favorites. Once again, the narrative about the family of Israel is not simplistic or picture perfect. As we've seen elsewhere in Genesis, there is so much dysfunction in this extended family narrative. But their narrative, again, proves that God's purposes work in, through, and even in spite of human planning and failure. The Joseph story can be broken into three basic parts: Joseph's early life, Joseph's trials and rise to power in Egypt, and Joseph's eventual reunification with his family. I'll discuss each of these briefly in turn. The opening verses of chapter 37 provide foundational information about Joseph and his family. In these verses, we learn that Jacob, now called Israel occasionally, loves Joseph more than any of his other children. Joseph is, without a doubt, his father's favorite, and his dad gives him a sweet new robe with long sleeves as a demonstration of his favor. The result? Joseph's brothers despise him. They can't even speak peaceably to him. They hate their brother. And Joseph doesn't do himself any favors. Whether out of arrogance or a lack of maturity, Joseph shares a dream that he has with his older brothers. While much of the dream is symbolic, Joseph's brothers don't miss its significance. Joseph is suggesting that he, the youngest brother, will somehow become lord over them. He will reverse cultural expectations about birth order and blessing, and he will be exalted over all of them. What an arrogant... Well, you know how that would end. Near the middle of chapter 37, things get really bad for Joseph. His dad sends him out to retrieve his brothers who are shepherding the flocks. When he arrives, without the protection of his father, his brothers devise a sinister plan. Originally, they intend to kill Joseph and dispose of the body. But his brother intervenes. Well, kind of. Eventually, they decide to simply sell their brother into slavery and to tell their father that Joseph was eaten by a wild animal. I bet Thanksgiving dinners with this family were super fun. This brings us to the second part of Joseph's story. The slave traders eventually bring Joseph to Egypt, where he becomes an enslaved person in the household of Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh. The opening of chapter 39 adds a theological framework for Joseph's situation. Despite his hardship, despite his situation, God is with Joseph and enables Joseph to be successful as a result. Joseph becomes the overseer over all of the other enslaved persons in Potiphar's house, and Potiphar's household experiences great economic success as a result of Joseph's presence. Just when things are looking up for Joseph, things again get pretty rough. His master's wife takes a liking to him and tries to proposition him for sexual relations. Now, we know from ancient slavery practices that this was actually a common thing, and it wasn't illegal, and it wasn't even really perceived to be morally wrong for a master to have sexual relations with their enslaved persons of either gender. But despite this sort of acceptability, Joseph refuses. And Potiphar's wife takes things into her own hands. She falsely accuses Joseph of sexual assault, and this lands Joseph in prison. Similar to his experience as an enslaved person in Potiphar's house, God makes the best out of his time as a wrongly incarcerated person. Once again, Joseph is successful because the Lord was with him. While in prison, Joseph displays an uncanny ability to interpret the dreams of his fellow incarcerated persons. After some time, his reputation as an interpreter of dreams comes to reach the ears of Pharaoh, who is himself having some troubling dreams. Joseph successfully interprets Pharaoh's dreams, and this puts him in the king's good graces. And once again, Joseph is on the up and up again. So much so, in fact, that he becomes almost second in command to Pharaoh, and he exercises tremendous authority in the land of Egypt. With this second part of the story reaching its end in chapter 41, we reach the sort of final part of Joseph's story in chapters 42. An important corollary to Joseph's dream interpretation and his rise to power in Egypt is a famine that impacts the entire ancient Near Eastern world of the time. In his role, Joseph helps Egypt and Pharaoh navigate this famine successfully, so much so that Egypt comes to provide grain for the entire world. And so because of this famine, Jacob, some years later, sends his sons to Egypt to procure grain for their own survival. And here's when the sibling rivalry begins to work itself out, but not without some twists and turns. In short, Joseph recognizes his brothers, but they don't recognize him in his position of power. Through a series of encounters and a couple of elaborate tests, Joseph and his brothers are eventually reconciled. Joseph is soon reunited with his father, and the brothers make their way to Egypt, but that is a topic for next time. It seems, at least for a hot second, that all is well with Jacob's family. If you've been following along, you will have noticed that I skipped over chapter 38 entirely. This chapter contains another story that likely won't be included in your children's study Bible or in the Godly Play curriculum. Similar to the parts of the Joseph story, chapter 38 contains deception and intrigue. And like the earlier stories of Sarah, Hagar, and Rebekah, chapter 38 is concerned with a woman's ability or even her right to bear children. So chapter 38 is all about one of Jacob's sons, Judah, his 3 sons, and his daughter-in-law, Tamar. The basic contours of the story are as follows. Judah has 3 sons, Er, Onan, and Shelah. Judah arranges a marriage between Er and a woman named Tamar. Er dies, and so, following a practice that is prescribed by later legal traditions, Tamar is passed down to his second son Onan, so that he might father a male child through and for her. Onan also dies. And then Judah falsely claims that his youngest son, Shelah, is too young to take on the responsibility of fathering a child with Tamar. Don't worry, there won't be a quiz on this series of events. But here's where things start to get messy. Judah's wife dies, and after a period of mourning, he travels to visit a prostitute. Tamar, fearing that she will never procure an heir through Judah's family, takes matters into her own hands. She dresses up like a prostitute, has sex with her father-in-law, and conceives. As news of her pregnancy becomes public, there is a rush to put her to death because of her alleged adultery. But because of some trickery of her own, she is able to prove that Judah is her baby's daddy and that she is innocent of adultery. She walks away vindicated. And what's really interesting about this story is that one of Tamar's sons becomes the forefather of the royal line from which David and Jesus come. Talk about a complicated family history. I've left out some details for you to discover on your own. Once again, I hope you can see how some of the names and the stories that you are familiar with have some strange or even troubling aspects to them. Many of the characters are flawed. Nearly all of them act out of self-interest or even envy and greed. What kind of family is this? And what kind of God is this to covenant with them? Once again, I encourage you to pay attention to character developments as you read this section of Genesis. What kind of person is Joseph? Or Jacob, for that matter, or Reuben? What about Judah and Tamar? Pay attention to subtle details about insiders and outsiders. Notice how male and female characters are portrayed and how these portraits reflect cultural assumptions about gender and the household. Finally, don't miss what these chapters say about God. In several places, there are short statements made about God's role in the unfolding drama. What do you make of these statements? What is the relationship between divine will and human freedom? There's so much more that could be said about these chapters, but hopefully I've given you enough to dive into this fascinating story. Happy reading.